Welcome to this video version of the BC COVID-19 Modeling Group Report. This is our third report being released on May 14th, 2021. In this video, I will review some of our projections for the next month or so, and this is work that we've been busy with over the last couple of weeks. So before I get started, let me just remind you a bit about who we are. The group consists of academics from UBC, University of British Columbia, Simon Fraser University, and University of Victoria, as well as a few related individuals, all of whom have expertise in data analysis and or modeling in epidemiology, and some of us coming from related areas. We're an independent group, independent of the BC government and the BC CDC, although some of us do have ties with people at the BC CDC. All of the analysis covered by this report is based on publicly available data, and the data that we're working with is up to date as of May 13th. So let me start by running over some of the key messages from our recent work. So unchanged from the last report is the projection that cases will continue to decline through May. Hospital and ICU occupancy will also decline, but will still be relatively high throughout the rest of May. Lifting the March 30th measures and returning to February-March activity levels on May 21st, as currently planned, will lead to growth in cases in hospital and ICU occupancy, but by late June, vaccination will catch up and rein in that growth, which is good news. So interestingly, the most recent data indicates that our March 30th measures and subsequent changes in behavior had a larger impact on the growth of the faster growing variant of concern cases than they had on the non-VOC cases, which is interesting and has some interesting implications for understanding how the measures are having an effect. So let me dive into some of the details behind what I'm referring to here in this summary. So this slide here shows Jens von Bergmann's analysis of the currently available data. The vertical lines, which you see here in red and green, these show the dates of measures being imposed, those are the red ones, and measures being removed, those are the green ones. And as you can see, transitions between growth and decline in cases are generally associated with these measure changes. So you see here early in the pandemic, there's a bunch of measures put into place which brought this growth under control. And then later we released those measures. Not much happened until later in the summer when cases began to grow again, and a rapid growth leading up to the end of the year when measures were put in place again, which turned around that rapid growth and brought it back down. And we saw another growth here. This was not because of the release or removal of measures, but rather the introduction of the variant of concern, the UK variant specifically. And that led to a rapid rise again to what's been referred to as the third wave. But then the measures put in place on March 30th also had a strong effect, bringing that back down under control. So the message here is just from a simple analysis, we're clearly capable of keeping the spread under control using these types of measures, even the recent rise of the VOCs, which is kind of amazing given how much more transmissible it is and how little that was actually expected by most experts. So notice now that the ongoing decline in cases is, according to Jens's analysis here, more due to the decline in the non-VOC than in the VOC. So you can see that this is the VOC component, or the non-VOC component, and this is the variant of concern component, which isn't decreasing quite as much. And that's not surprising given its higher transmissibility. So here you can see a little bit more clearly that idea highlighted, where the VOCs are just barely decaying a bit here, whereas the big drop that we're currently seeing is due to the wild type strain or variant disappearing from the population. So in this next slide, I'm showing Dean Carlin's projections, and that's broken up by health authority. This is directly from our last report, but he's added in the new cases here in red, which were not part of his projections previously. And Dean's analysis here fits, what he does is he fits a model which includes ongoing vaccinations and the variant of concern cases explicitly modeled, and it fits that to the case data. That's allowing for sudden changes in transmission at these vertical lines. Now, those vertical lines are actually fit by the model, not prescribed, but they match fairly well to the measures that were present on the previous slide from Jens's work. Notice that this newly available case data, which is here in the province-wide, and you can see it throughout here, and so on. The red dots, these fall mostly within the 68% confidence bands, which is that green shading, which says that that his modeling is actually doing a fairly good job. And this is fairly typical for his model over the past year plus. So Dean's latest projections, these are updated to include those red data points. Here, assuming the current measures remain in place indefinitely, an assumption will loosen on the next slide, and the recently announced updated vaccine schedule, so this is including now up to 45,000 vaccinations per day. This shows continued decline in the future here in case counts. Now that's with the measures left in place, which is not the current plan. And so let's see what he predicts when we lift those. So here, this slide shows the same model, but now with lifting of the March 30th measures and returning to February-March activity levels. So he's included both optimistic and pessimistic vaccination projections here. So the optimistic projection, the dashed lines, so you can see that here, they separate out right there. And in this one, the hospitalization and ICU, they're a little bit harder to see there. That's the optimistic projection, and that includes the color shading confidence bands. Here he's assuming 45,000 vaccinations per day, up to an eventual 75% of the population vaccinated. So that's accounting for vaccine hesitancy and vaccination of only 12-year-old and older individuals in the population. So that's why it's only 75%. And as well as an eventual first dose efficacy of 90%, which is the more optimistic range, although still realistic. The pessimistic projection, which is the dotted black here. So that assumes 35,000 vaccinations per day, up to an eventual 65% of the population vaccinated, and an eventual first dose efficacy of about 80%. So you can see that in both scenarios, cases continue to decline briefly after the release of measures. So that's, not there, that's somewhere around here going down. That's just a few days for the infections to start developing after the initial contacts begin. And then increase later on, and they both increase, one more than the other, through June, but then vaccinations catch up in late June and bring that spread back under control. So if you look at the bottom graph in the blue and the pink there, you see hospital and ICU occupancy dropping, but to levels like we saw in February, March, which is still elevated compared to the early fall back here, where those levels were quite a bit lower and less stressful on the front line. So Dean then asked the question, well, what if we hold off another 3 weeks on the release of those measures? So if we wait that additional 3 weeks before releasing the measures, that rebound that we saw on the previous slide is crushed as the decline due to the current measures transitions into decline due to vaccination. So there's no hump in there because there's no gap in that sort of coverage. So both these scenarios are better than many experts had feared when the UK variant first appeared in BC. And it also illustrates a now typical and difficult public health decision to push back opening to avoid that additional hospital occupancy and associated mortality, or push forward with reopening knowing that prolonged or uncontrolled spread is unlikely. And that's a decision I and we are not directly involved in, but understand the difficulties of it. Okay, so this is another slide from Dean. This is a different type of analysis. So what you see here, the dots in each of these plots with the entire province up here in the first panel, and the rest of the plots here are just broken out by health authority. So the dots show the ratio of the variant of concern cases to non-variant of concern cases, starting in mid-February. So that's February down here, and going until now. And you can see that rising from a level over to the whole province of about 0.02 up to getting close to 10, and in fact in Vancouver Coastal getting over 10. So that corresponds to a rise from about 2 VOC cases for every 100 non-VOC cases, and that's rising to 10 VOC cases, or getting up towards 10 VOC cases for every 1 non-VOC case. So it's a dramatic turnover from the non-variant to the variant. This ratio is particularly useful because it provides a direct measure of the relative growth rate of the two variants. So this takes just a little bit of high school math to demonstrate, but I won't go through that. But the summary point of that is what you really have to do then is look at the slope. The slope is the informative piece of information here. If that ratio, if these slopes here had been perfectly horizontal instead of tilted like they are, that would tell us that the two strains grow at the exact same rate. And a positive slope says that the VOC, because that's in the numerator of this ratio, would be growing faster. And the steeper that line, the more extreme that difference in growth rates. And when I say growth rates, they could both be growing, both shrinking, one growing, one shrinking. That actually, doesn't really matter. What it tells us is which one has the growth advantage, whether it's up or down. And that relative behavior comes out in the slope. So what you see here, which is really the most interesting feature of this slide, is this very clear kink that appears in all of these graphs except for the northern, which just doesn't have enough data for it to come out. And what that says is that through February and March, the VOCs were outpacing the non-VOCs consistently at a fairly steady difference in growth rate. But then with the March 30th measures and the subsequent change in the growth of both of the variants, suddenly the VOC growth advantage took a big hit. So this is interesting. It has some implications for what might be causing the additional spread of the VOC. And that means the measures were fortunately disproportionately more effective against the VOC than non-VOC. So here is another model, this one from Elisha Are and Carolyn Collane. This is an SIR type ODE model with Bayesian fitting of parameters. So they find that even a 30% increase in contact rates as of May 25th is not enough to cause a return to growth in case numbers. This, you remember, Dean's projections said that if we go back to early February, March levels by May 25th, we'll have this initial rise. So 30% is actually below what Dean is using. So these two models do end up being consistent, even though that's not obvious from the details I've given you here. So this is another model from Carolyn's group. This one quite a bit more complicated, including age and essential worker compartments, and addresses asymptomatic infections, albeit in a simple way. They find that a moderate increase in the R value up to 1.7 with ongoing vaccination gives a similar increase in cases, followed by a decline as we saw in Dean's model. So this is with May 25th reopening, and as you increase the R value, so that's more ambitious reopening, it leads to a return in the most dramatic case here, which is not all that dramatic, to recent peak values and a prolonged for a prolonged period of time. So it's important to note here that this model assumes only first dose efficacy, and many other factors are held constant that would likely change, for example, school reopening and seasonal changes in spread. So everything beyond September here should be seen as an illustration of the model's dynamics in an idealized situation and not really as a projection. So here Carolyn has done something very similar to what Dean did by postponing the opening from May 25th to June 15th, just to test and see if she sees similar things with a very different model. And as you can see, delaying that opening makes a difference in that you lose that early June burst, and you just have continual decline throughout. So again, as Dean saw, that measures induced decline transitions smoothly into a vaccination induced decline. So the next few slides are all about the question of reaching herd immunity. So each ring that you see here represents an age cohort, and its area is proportional to the fraction of the population in that cohort. The coloring shows vaccination data as of May 1st, with dark red being singly vaccinated and orange fully vaccinated. You can see the older cohorts have been largely vaccinated already, mostly with a single dose, and the younger cohorts less so. Now, if you rearrange these colored regions, so taking this coloring here and sort of fitting it in like puzzle pieces over here, you can write down, or you can sort of draw the picture with an average vaccination across all age cohorts, and that would correspond to a mostly dark red sector like that up until May 1st. And we don't have the age specific data for more recently, but we do have the average. And so those lines progress from May 1st to May 7th to May 13th. So you can sort of see in those May tags, May 1st, 7th, and 13th tags, the progress around the circle. And obviously the goal is to get all the way around, although that's going to be quite difficult, as I'll map out on the next few slides. So herd immunity, which is the fraction of the population that needs to be immune in order to ensure that the virus can't spread, is all the way around here for a virus with an R naught of 5 to 6, which is the range for the VOCs currently spreading in BC. So that's our ideal target. Just to be able to safely return to February-March activity levels, we have to get around to here, which we've passed already for the older cohorts, but not yet for the under 60s, which is why it would still be risky to lift measures now. And when you have a structured population like this, the notion of herd immunity is complicated by the fact that the average doesn't really quite capture exactly what's going on. So now that we have an idea of where the target is, let's ask the question, how far around can we reasonably expect to get? So only about 86% of BC is willing to get vaccinated, according to polls, which brings our upper limit down from 100% vaccination down to 86%. Only 90% of those are over the age of 12, so that brings us down yet again. And already between those two, you can see that we're falling short of the full herd immunity. But there's more. So right now, we're only working with first doses. And the efficacies, that is the fraction of vaccinations that end up being successful, depend on the version, either Pfizer or Moderna or AstraZeneca. So those efficacies were only pinned down roughly. We've got pretty wide confidence intervals for the efficacies, but you can see them drawn out here. So if everybody had been vaccinated with Pfizer, then this fraction that we've already brought down to here would have to be brought down to somewhere in between these two bands, which is this blue interval here. So let's say we take the middle of that as just a gauge. So that would be the Pfizer level. If it was everybody was Moderna, we'd be somewhere similar, and AstraZeneca possibly a little bit lower. I mean, it's not going to be the midpoint of those intervals, but the point is that this line gets pushed back. This is like the maximum vaccination we can expect to get to, and that gets pushed back to somewhere in this range here, which is clearly below this herd immunity target up here. So this is what the current vaccine registration looks like. So what this means is here we had that 86% line of corresponding to hesitancy, and all of this gray in here corresponds to people who are not hesitant but are also not registered. And what that means is that they won't be easily contacted when vaccines become available for them. So tell everyone you know to get registered. And so how do we, aside from this registration and getting vaccines out more quickly, how do we manage this gap? So hopefully the vaccines will be approved for kids under 12 by this summer, and then start working on your vaccine hesitant aunt, uncle, grandkid, or whoever, because that's our best chance of getting back to normal soon. So I'll just close here with further messages, some of these repeated. First, case numbers are projected to decline through May, which is great news, with hospital and ICU occupancy remaining still high, but on the way down. Partial reopening as planned May 25th risks that slight rise in cases and hospital occupancy, but that'll come down as vaccinations catch up. Any reopening beyond early 2021 activity levels would require higher vaccination uptake, second doses, additional control measures, and so on. So we're not totally out of the woods here. And finally, some points that I didn't include here but are in the report. There's really a need for more data transparency. So this last point here, newly shared community level data on cases and vaccinations will help guide future modeling and improve our ability to get closer to herd immunity and get us out of this pandemic mess. So thanks for watching all the way through, if you did, and I'll see you for the next report in a couple of weeks.